Imagine a future where machines do everything for us, where humans just atrophy, where we become so reliant on automation that we literally can't walk anymore, where we can clap our hands and a robot will just suddenly appear to tend to our every whim, whether that's a drink or shade from the sun. And isn't this just the plot of WALL-E? Fair to say that the fact that we haven't created hover chairs yet means we're a little way off Disney's prediction, but in reality, the future might actually be closer than you think. It's not curious and heartwarming little robots like WALL-E, and it's not big, scary, evil Terminators either. It's something a little bit more insidious, a little bit more closer to home, and you might be using it every day. It's AI, and specifically ChatGPT. And it's not just tasks we're outsourcing either. We might be outsourcing our intelligence. Is this the dawn of a new era of human ingenuity, or is this a fast track to intellectual laziness? Stick around, because the latest research is sounding some serious alarms. 30th of November 2022. It's not a date that's burned into my memory, but it marks a significant point in human history, one that I think we'll look back on. Because this is a day that everything changed, that AI went from this abstract conversation to something that was really here and usable. I was not an early adopter, I'll admit, but like many of us, as time went on and I heard more about it, I got curious, and so I decided to give it a go. And initially I scoffed at the hallucinations and the inaccuracies, but actually over time I found myself thinking, this is actually useful. Of course, the utility of ChatGPT depends on what you use it for, and while there are some CEOs who are dreaming of replacing everyone with AI and gleefully rubbing their hands at bringing in the dystopia, there are also huge medical advancements being heralded in by AI diagnostic tools. The utility directly depends on what you use it for. The involvement of AI in many locations is controversial, but perhaps one of the industries that has been most disrupted by this is the world of education. So giving away my age here a little, I am a student of the internet era. I grew up in a pretty techie family, and I actually knew what a computer virus was before I knew that humans could get one too. That is a true story, and I was very confused when I found that out. As a teen, I spent hours getting Steam games to run on my Linux laptop, and I remember being called a nerd by one of my IT teachers for writing in HTML. By the time I got to university, some things had been drilled into me. Always check websites to make sure they're a reputable source. Wikipedia is not a reputable source, and don't talk to strangers online. So when it came to university, I was making use of the tools available to me. I was using Wikipedia to look up maths concepts, trusting hopefully that those were right and no one had the incentive to actually mess those up. I was reading papers on Google Scholars to find references. I was using Wolfram Alpha on the problems that my friends and I were getting stuck on, so we had the solution that we could try and reverse engineer to actually finish our assignments. Fast forward to more than a decade later, and the academic environment looks completely different. Instead of just looking up a solution on Wolfram Alpha and puzzling about how it got there, ChatGPT can just tell you what the solution is. It can give you the exact steps it took. It can write things up in LaTeX, so it's brilliantly formatted and you can just copy and paste that into your paper. And I haven't done any proofs for a while, but I'm pretty sure ChatGPT could have a go at some of those fundamental ones as well. In the end, the majority of my degree was based in exams. Hours sat in a silent hall, hand cramping from writing, no involvement of AI there at all. But for subjects that are a little less exam heavy and a little bit more coursework oriented, then ChatGPT is a serious issue. I mean, why would you write your own essay if ChatGPT can just do it for you? This creates a huge problem for universities and professors. I mean, plagiarism has been an issue in university for years, so much so that there's specialist software designed to detect when things have been copied and pasted and are too similar to other sources. Universities have really advanced disciplinary procedures for plagiarism, and any student that has been caught out by this has found out the hard way that cheaters never prosper. But if your essay is completely new, original content, then it's not going to get flagged, even if the original content wasn't created by the person whose name is in the top corner. What's to stop someone from asking their essay question to ChatGPT and just copy and pasting what it spits out there? Well, the fact that it's probably morally wrong, but that hasn't stopped cheaters in the past, so that's not really a strong argument. There's the fact that it hallucinates and it gets things wrong, but if your marker can't tell that you use ChatGPT, then you just got a few bits wrong and you lost a few marks. And that can be a worthwhile trade-off if it saved you a lot of time in exchange for losing a few marks. There's an argument that it devalues degrees from the perspective of a future employer, because if ChatGPT has raised the bar for what's good and then everyone is just ChatGPT good, then the degree itself just doesn't become that useful. And yes, that is a valid argument, but in reality, it's abstracted away from you as an individual. You can only control what you do. You can't control what other people do, so if they're going to devalue the degree anyway, well, if you can't beat them, you might as well join them. But here's why you might want to think twice about that. So given ChatGPT has only existed for about less than 3 years at this point, it's really hard to get a full idea of the impact that it's having. I mean, it's still very early days in the technology. However, it has been enough time that the first research has started to come out on this. So today we're going to look at some of that research that's out there. So one of the use cases that has been suggested for AI is personalized learning. So it will break things down in a way that suits you and your learning style so that you can grasp it a lot better. If you need the ELI 5 version, then it will give it to you. It'll explain it to you in the most basic concepts. But if you are advanced in a particular field, then it can take it to that level and use all the terminology that you already understand so that you can get just the incremental part that you need to learn. It'll also open up the ability for you to ask it questions so you can drill down on bits, clarify your understanding, and explore the bits that are really important to you. Sounds wonderful, right? A truly personalized learning experience. Now, obviously, this isn't the reality we live in today. Ask ChatGPT a simple question and you're going to get a 12-paragraph essay in response. That's definitely not something that's broken down for a 5-year-old, and while we can improve that with better prompting, there's still some limits there. So let's assume that we do have reasonably good prompting for the rest of this video. The cognitive load theory suggests that human working memory has a limited capacity for learning, and learning takes up a lot of cognitive resources. So if we could have something that made that learning experience slightly easier, that would free up cognitive resources that could be used on actually retaining the information rather than struggling through the learning process and using a lot of energy that way. So earlier I suggested that ChatGPT can write you essays, and some of you more skeptical people might have been a bit like, yeah, well, are these essays actually any good? So I have a study looking into that. In this study, students were split into 4 groups: those who had LLM support, those who had support from a person, a human educator, those who had some specific writing tool support, and those that had to completely go at it alone and generate their own essay. In the study, they measured a few things: metacognitive load, intrinsic motivation, learning, and the actual quality of the essays themselves. What they found was that intrinsic motivation wasn't actually particularly different between the 2 groups, and actually neither was learning. But for the LLM group, they freed up a lot of cognitive load, and they actually had better quality essays, so that's great, right? Those who used ChatGPT didn't have worse motivation, they learned about the same, so case closed. We freed up space, so let's all use ChatGPT to write our essays. But actually, let's go a little bit deeper. It's funny because what wasn't immediately clear from the abstract of this paper is that the students weren't actually meant to use ChatGPT to write the essay, they were meant to just use it for research. And apparently there were tools and blocks put in place so that ChatGPT can only be used for research. But the authors of the study actually think that the students managed to bypass it, and they actually watched in a live lab setting as one of the students just took and copied and pasted stuff from ChatGPT that had been optimized for the scoring rubric, which I assume they'd been given out already. Led them to conclude 2 things. One, that the heightened performance might be because of AI-empowered learning, where they use ChatGPT for short-term empowering themselves to do well at this particular task, but that it affects long-term learning. And that ChatGPT scored so well on the essays because the scoring system was there, so you could tailor it towards that. Maybe this is just cope by the authors, but actually we're going to look into something else. I needed to find somewhere quiet to film, so I've tucked myself into this little phone booth here. One valid argument that I'm sure is going to come up in the comments is the fact that the LLMs are improving all the time, new versions of ChatGPT are being released that are improved, and so looking at these old studies are potentially a bit out of date, maybe don't hold up as much when it comes to actually using the new versions, which is why I was really glad to find a study based on ChatGPT 4.0, the latest version at the time of writing this script, because that is as cutting edge as we're going to get. Now, I'm not going to go into the full detail of the study. You can find it in the description below, I've linked it down there. But actually what's really interesting about this study is they were able to brain scan the essay writers as they were writing their essays and found some interesting things in terms of neural connectivity. So for example, those using Google search instead of just coming up with an essay using their own brain had 43 to 48% less neural connectivity than those just using their own brains to write the essay. Those that use an LLM, ChatGPT again in this case, had 55% less connectivity. Some of the things they tested included ownership and the ability to remember their essay or recall what they'd written. And what's really interesting about the ownership is the amount of people in the LLM group who actually denied writing the essay or only took partial credit, and it'd be really interesting to see stats on their feelings on ChatGPT going into the experiment to see if that correlates. The most interesting though was a recall, because after the first of 3 essay writing sessions, 83% of the LLM users couldn't actually quote from their essay at all, and none of them actually got their quotes accurate. Whereas for the ones using Google search and the ones doing essays from their own brain, they had almost perfect recall ability by session 2, with brain obviously being the most accurate. I'll note as well, in this study, they actually had some human assessors reading and scoring their essays, and without knowing what the experiment was, the human assessors actually noticed a similar writing style across a number of essays, and those were the LLM groups. So maybe your teacher's a little bit more clued in than you think. Anyway, you might be thinking, okay, well, if it's something that I care about, then I will do it myself so that I remember it. But if it's something that I don't care about and I just need to get through, then I'll just use the LLM. And here's why the study has another cautionary tale for you. They brought a group of people in for a 4th session, in which those that had used the LLM for the first 3 sessions use their brains only, and those that use their brains only use the LLM for that session. And they got them to write on a familiar topic, a topic they'd covered already. Those in the LLM to now brain only group did show a bit higher neural connectivity than the brain only group originally did, but it was nowhere near as high as the brain only group found in their 2nd and 3rd session, which might show that LLMs can show an initial boost, but it doesn't last. There's no deeper neural integration. Brain to LLM group had even more connectivity after using the LLM in the 4th round, and actually 78% of them could quote accurately and only 11% couldn't quote at all, which is completely the opposite in the former LLM, now brain group. So putting this simply, using ChatGPT too early in the learning process results in worse recall and worse learning outcomes. I'm going to read you an exact quote from the paper here. While these tools offer unprecedented opportunities for enhancing learning and information access, their potential impact on cognitive development, critical thinking and intellectual independence demands a very careful consideration and continued research. Okay, so we've looked at ChatGPT writing essays, but what you might be thinking is, well, you're a data science channel, why are you making a video essay about writing essays? See what I did there? Let's look into this from the science side of things. In a study where students had to research the impact of nanoparticles in sun cream and make recommendations and justify those recommendations, there wasn't really a difference in the diversity between those using Google and those using LLMs, which is kind of contrasting with the previous studies where people using LLMs were a bit more samey on their topics and people not using them were a bit more open-ended. Getting even closer to data science, a study in Taiwan split some programming learners into 2 groups. They were learning C++ with a teacher in a classroom and problem sets, and the second group got the ability to use ChatGPT to help them work out their problems. And the authors of the study went in fully expecting ChatGPT to significantly enhance their C++ learning. I bet you can guess what happened. The ability to go into flow state, which is meant to improve learning, the self-efficacy and the learning all took a hit in the ChatGPT group. So how do we rationalize this against all the excitement about incorporating ChatGPT into education? Because it wasn't the hallucinations or the inaccuracies that were causing an issue. I mean, the recommendations matched with those of the Google searches, and the essays were of good quality. And okay, in the program example, it did get some wrong, but there were other issues there as well. So what was the reason? Actually, the theories of learning are kind of counterintuitive. It turns out that the best way to learn something isn't to break it down into the smallest digestible chunks and learn it in a way that makes it really easy to learn. Actually, in order to learn something, to properly encode it into our memory, we actually need a little bit of struggle. It turns out that what we need to learn is called desirable difficulties. Now, not too much difficulty. If it's really far beyond us and a massive struggle, then we're not going to learn either. But what we want is just enough difficulty and just enough struggle that it starts to sink in. Desirable difficulties are where the learning happens. So what are desirable difficulties? Well, there are 4 main categories, one of which is varying the conditions of learning. Another is interleaved practice, so you space it out with different topics in between. Another one is just spacing out in general. And the last one is using tests rather than presentations. So that's how it should sound when it's all together. So the way I used to approach this section, and I used to approach learning in general, would have been to practice that bit over and over again until I got it right. Maybe I'd take one hand at a time, maybe I'd just play the right hand. Maybe I'd just play the left hand, which is a bit harder. And so I would repeat it over and over again, and it felt like I was learning, but in reality, I wasn't actually getting any better until I started varying the conditions of learning. So I'm going to give you an example now of varying the conditions of learning. I can change the rhythm in different ways as well, maybe something like this. This part of the piece is played in something we call legato. It's nice and smooth. So what if I play it detached? You might be able to tell that I found that version harder. That is a desirable difficulty by definition. It seems unintuitive, but after I switched to this style of learning, it rapidly improved my performance and my speed of learning pieces as well. So my piano playing anecdote is all well and good, but that is just a sample of one. So let's look at a study instead, one at which kids were to practice throwing a beanbag at a particular target, but they couldn't see the target at the time of throw, so they had to practice it by feel alone. They split the group into two. One half the kids practiced just throwing at the same distance over and over again, which would be the test distance. The other group varied it. They threw at a closer distance, they threw at a further distance, and over time they practiced throwing at different distances. The ones that practiced with a variable distance were far more successful when it came to the actual test. Similarly, I could use other forms of desirable difficulties. I could use interleave practice and practice another section that I find tricky in between practicing this one. I could space it out. That's why they say do a little bit of practice every day instead of trying to get it all in one go in one day. And I can also test myself by doing mock performances, even if my audience is just this camera. So relating this back to the studies from earlier, the students weren't learning because there was no concept of desirable difficulties. They asked ChatGPT for the answer, and ChatGPT just gave it to them in bite-sized chunks or things they could literally copy and paste. A complete absence of desirable difficulties, and therefore an absence of learning too. What's key to note about learning with desirable difficulties is that in the moment it doesn't actually feel like it's helping us. It feels like things are harder that they aren't going in, and where if I practice the same section over and over again, at the end I feel much more competent, much more like I've got it. That actually doesn't last, and I'd be better off using desirable difficulties, walking away feeling like I don't have it, but actually I will have learned it better by the next time I sit down at my piano. We're often a poor judge of our learning, and just because it feels better doesn't mean it is. But actually when I look at these studies, the people using ChatGPT didn't even think it was improving their learning. In fact, one student in the study, after using it for 3 sessions, concluded that it just wasn't worth it to use ChatGPT to write the essays. And another student said that it was fine for structuring things, but for generating ideas, it didn't really help. In the programming study, one student was even more harsh, saying, "I transitioned from being able to learn to not being able to learn." Ouch. Now, there are a few gaps in this analysis. We can't say how experienced students were with ChatGPT. We can't say how good at prompting they were, and maybe better prompting would have done better. It's also the case that we are limited by what versions are available to us now, and that doesn't mean some far-off ChatGPT or similar LLM in the future could generate much better answers. But given everything we know about learning right now, where does that leave us? One thing that's important to note about all of these studies is that ChatGPT was used to do a task, to write an essay, or to make research for recommendations, or to solve a programming problem. It wasn't actually used directly to help the people in learning. But when it comes to school and university work, the whole point of having an essay to write or a problem set isn't to just do the thing, it's to do the learning. It's a varied condition of learning. It's probably set spaced out from the initial lesson that you had on this topic. It's probably interleaved with other topics, and it can act as a test of ability, hitting all 4 of the conditions under which we learn best. By actually doing it yourself, you're significantly improving your learning. So what does this say? That we should all just give up on ChatGPT? That the younger generations are doomed to a future of being completely unemployable? Well, come on, it's a bit more nuanced than that. Despite ChatGPT not being useful for learning across these studies, it did actually have utility. It was really good for structuring things and putting ideas together for the essays. And in the group that got to use it after they'd already learnt about the topic, they actually performed better, so it can be useful for revisiting concept as well. Using ChatGPT the right way is key. I didn't use ChatGPT to research this video, and the more of these papers I read, the more glad I was that I didn't use it. But emboldened by my research, I decided to use ChatGPT to help me put the structure of this video together. And despite the fact it's evolved from there, it gave me a blueprint from which I could get started. And of course, I do need to mention that all of these studies were done using ChatGPT, and other LLMs are available, but given the learning that we've had today, I think this is probably generalizable beyond just ChatGPT. So where does this leave you, the viewer, looking to build your data science skills? Well, I've given you the conditions for best learning, of course, so you can go off and do them. But actually, I think what's even more important is this. The fact that in a world where ChatGPT is so ubiquitous and people are using it to not actually learn, just to get the problems done, to pass a course and get the grade, employers are actually going to be looking for people who can genuinely do the work, who can learn, who can come up with ideas, who can be innovative, and all of that comes from learning properly. And that's our mission at EvaWorks, to enable people to learn with the right desirable difficulties and get rid of the noise that isn't helpful in any way, shape or form. So join us on our journey. Like and subscribe, and join the Evil Lair via the link in the description.